when Earth creationists do good quality work, it can make it into secular journals. There's rumors that there's this huge conspiracy against creationists or whatever. And when I've actually talked to researchers who are creationists or who used to be creationists, most of them think this is overstated. There's certain groups of people who think they, can comment on anything, but the experts just don't take them seriously because they can see that they're not engaging with the actual details that the experts are.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with a Christian scientist to talk about if the field of science is it trustworthy, who do we trust, when do we trust, and specifically on the topics of evolution and the age of the Earth. How do we figure out the answers to these questions? Dr. Ardern, how are you doing today? And can you give us a little bit about your background on the topic?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. So I'm currently based in Cambridge in the UK. I've been here for a year now. And I'm a researcher in microbial genetics. So I look at how different bacteria are different from each other, basically, and what we can think about their history based on that. Before that, I was a postdoc in Germany for 5 years, mostly at the Technical University of Munich. And before that, I did my PhD in New Zealand on the topic of experimental evolution. So looking at evolution over really short timeframes. And my undergraduate background was in biology and philosophy. So I'm really interested in things like the philosophy of science and questions like, can we trust science? What is science? That kind of thing. So I'm looking forward to talking about that today.
Yeah, this is going to be great. Okay, so I wanted to start this out with a very popular phrase, and I think it's very true, but I'm also very interested to see what you think about it. So Frank Turek, the very popular apologist Frank Turek, says,
"Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. All science gives you is the evidence. You have to gather the evidence and then interpret the evidence, and no evidence is self-interpreting. All evidence, all data needs to be interpreted. And so you can look at this evidence as a juror, as a scientist, and say, first of all, is this evidence good? And secondly, is it good? Does it point more toward guilt or innocence? A scientist has to do that. Science doesn't say a thing.
Can you talk about if this is a good approach to take on the topic as far as and how it relates to the topic of science and if we can trust it or not?
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think it's true to some extent, and also there's complexities that make it interesting. So one thing I'd say is that there is a scientific community, and you can think about what the scientific community as a whole has kind of established in terms of what the general perspective of that community is. And there are some things where there's really clear consensus, like the approximate age of the Earth and that kind of thing. Lots of scientific laws, lots of findings have been pretty well established by science, and the vast majority of scientists will accept that, and the experts will know some of the evidence behind why it's a good reason to accept these things. So there's individuals, but there is also a community, and the community can come to a consensus on some topics. So that's one aspect, but also another way in which science is not just a bunch of separate individuals with their own opinions is that it's also a network of institutions. So scientists are usually embedded within like a university or a research institute. So I'm working in a research institute, for instance, and so there's the kind of physical institutions, but there's also things like journals that we'll talk about a bit later, I think, and the methods of science and the practices of science. In a way, that's part of the institution of science. So that's another way to see science as not just this kind of disparate collection of individuals, but there is a unity to it, both in the community and the consensus the community comes to, but also the networks of institutions and practices all really closely interrelated. So that's another reason to think that science does actually have some unity to it, and it's not just a bunch of individuals and what they happen to think.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Okay, so I'm no expert in the field, in the scientific field. Definitely not mine. This channel is mainly Bible focused, but I've been taught that scientists use things like the scientific method and other methods to prevent bias and come to accurate conclusions more consistently. Can you talk about what controls are in place in the field of science so that bias doesn't affect this as much?
Yeah, There's a lot of related issues there. For me, something that's really important in science is the technical sense of the control. So, like the positive and the negative control. So the positive control is if you've got a hypothesis, basically, and what would happen if the hypothesis was true. You can test that with a positive control. A negative control is what would happen. What happens if the test is not working, for instance. So there's a bunch of different controls and variations on controls in the technical experimental sense, and that's one important thing, which is just at the core of science, is trying to design your experiments carefully. So it's all about what do we expect if this hypothesis is true, and also what background information can we kind of bring to that to work out what our expectations should be. Yeah, so science is all about like trying to test something and see, is this a meaningful claim, and is this given that we have a meaningful claim, then we test it and see, okay, are the results that we see actually meaningful? Are they significant in some sense? So that, yeah, there's a lot of different practices that will be involved to try and filter out conclusions that aren't well evidenced or aren't well supported. And the exact details of the practices are going to differ a lot across the different fields of science. Yeah, so if you have any particular questions, we can maybe come to those later. The particular things that people might not trust about, say, evolution or the age of the Earth. Part of the complexity is it's made up of so many different sciences. Like biology is just one aspect of it. Actually, the age of the Earth is more about geology or planetary science, or there'll be some aspects from astronomy in there. And all these fields will have different methods as to how they're doing their particular experiments. But all of them are trying to control to get meaningful results.
Yeah. So, question on that. So,
yeah.
one control I can think of is, I just learned in my college classes in science, core classes, so not too crazy. But you have the scientific method, and I've even heard sometimes just say that some Christian scientists saying that they're, as their goal in the scientific method is to disprove their claim, which seems really weird because, if you're trying to make some big scientific claim, like you wouldn't want to try to disprove it. You want to give your best argument. So can you talk about like why that would happen, if that happens, and like if that's even effective?
Yeah, so that's one way to work out which hypotheses we should believe in. So it's called falsification. So the idea is that we put a bunch of hypotheses on the table and we try and falsify them. We try and show which ones fail our tests. And if they fail our test, then we can take them off the table, and then we're just left with fewer hypotheses. So that's one approach that a lot of people have thought science is about, and a lot of scientists take this view. So it was largely developed by Karl Popper, an influential philosopher of science. But this was a few decades ago, and actually there are some issues with that view of science. So I would say that's not the whole picture of science. It's one kind of practical way to think about how to sort out which hypotheses are true. But I would personally place more emphasis on the positive evidence for claims. So like I'm interested in like the cumulative case for a particular claim. So trying to bring together all the positive evidence for it from the different fields and see which hypotheses have the stronger case. You can make some kind of case for any hypothesis, but hypotheses will be competing with each other. And it might be that we have some kind of evidence for a claim, but a lot more evidence for a competing claim, and then we would want to go with that one. Yeah, so that's the way I about competing claims and trying to see where does the evidence overall point in a positive direction.
So, I mean, if you're just trying to bring in all the evidence, I mean, that seems like a really good way to, maybe we could talk about this later, but it seems like a really good way to, be biased in your approach and ignore the reasons not to take that claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so part of the story here is that it's not just one person doing this, but it's the whole community, each trying to show the advantages of different claims and debate amongst each other. Okay, which claim really has the most support? So this is where the idea of consensus, I think, is really important. That it's not just one person who's kind of doing their own little project and convincing themselves about something, because anyone can do that. But the challenge is for them to bring the evidence back to the community and persuade the rest of the community. And that's basically, I think, how science works, is about, teams of people working together in research groups, trying to see how good a particular hypothesis is, and maybe finding some evidence for it, and then bringing that evidence back to the rest of the community, and the rest of the community kind of dissecting the evidence and see if it really supports the claim that a particular group might be making.
Right. Okay, so scientists talk about, peer-reviewed journals, like that's supposedly the gold standard. If something isn't in peer review, oftentimes scientists just outright reject it. It seems like, to me at least. Can you talk about if this perception is true, and just also what's the significance of peer review, and like what does it benefit? What is the good part about it?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of peer review. Yeah, so peer review is a good minimal standard. It's a good kind of minimal threshold for a claim to pass. There are exceptions to that I'll come to in a second, but it's a good starting point. So peer review is when a claim has been made and experts in the field have checked it and think that it is well supported, or that it is coherent, that the arguments that were made to support the claim do actually make sense. And there haven't been kind of obvious counterexamples or evidence against that's been ignored in presenting the case. So I find a new biological phenomenon, and I think this is a real thing that is statistically significant, and I present my evidence for that, and I haven't ignored the counter arguments that have already been presented in the literature. If I do this and I persuade 2 or 3 experts, then a journal will publish this as a peer-reviewed paper, and that's basically how it works. So personally, I review a paper about once every month or once every 2 months at the moment, and part of the story of peer review is that I can see a paper that hasn't been reviewed yet because it's been posted on what's called a preprint server. So this is where scientists, especially recently, are posting their manuscripts before they've been reviewed, and then other scientists can look at them before they've gone through the lengthy process of going through review and revision, and they can see the newest results, but knowing that they haven't actually yet passed the expert review. So I can do that for manuscripts in my field where I know the authors, or I know the kind of data that they're working with, and I can already get a good sense of whether this is likely to go into a top journal or pass peer review, because I know the kind of data that they're working with. So I'm currently reviewing a manuscript. I haven't had a proper look at it yet, but I know the authors, and I know that it will be a good paper just based on their previous work and the kind of things that they've done. So yeah, this is how peer review works. The experts in the field decide whether the arguments are coherent and make sense and are well supported. And if they are, then it will go into peer review. So it's not a guarantee that it's perfect, and the experts may miss some things, but it's a good minimal standard for a manuscript to pass.
Fascinating. Okay, so many people watching this are going to be thinking that, peer review isn't perfect, has a lot of issues. We have peer review papers come out all the time that, especially during the, epidemic and all that, at the beginning, it's like, oh, there's so much evidence for this thing. And then, a few months later, it's like, oh, never mind, forget everything. It was a whole waste. You wasted all that time looking into that. So like, what's to say that an article, a peer review article, isn't biased or fake, or just trying to trick people? Like, you have money involved, all this other stuff. Like, what's to say that there are any guarantees that won't happen?
Yeah, so there's no 100% guarantees, but we can be very confident that there's no money involved, for instance, and that because the reviewers aren't known by the author, so they're kept secret, unless they choose to reveal themselves. But often it's kind of the culture of science that reviewers are kept secret from the authors of the manuscript. And in some disciplines, not so much in science, the authors of the manuscript are also kept secret from the reviewers. So And it's a very professional process that it's handled by an editor who is also an expert in the field, and they help to choose the reviewers, or they do choose the reviewers, and they try and make sure that the review is reasonable and makes good scientific points and that kind of thing. So there are some controls on the process. Some journals do it better than others, and some journals are more rigorous than others. And that's one reason why some journals are kind of more prestigious than others. It's not the only reason, but it is an important factor that if a paper has got into one of the journals that's considered more prestigious, then we have more reason to trust that it has actually gone through a rigorous peer review process. So there's a lot of journals which are known to be, by experts in the field, they're known to be less rigorous, or they're just very broad and they don't necessarily have the kind of expertise that you would want. So in my field, in evolutionary genetics, there's some journals that really specialize in this field. So I would actually trust some of the papers in these top journals more than I would trust a paper in, say, Nature or Science, which are very prestigious journals, but don't always have the community of experts to really give really rigorous analysis. So a paper in Nature or Science is likely to be kind of a really big, interesting claim, and it will have a lot of support for it, but it might not necessarily have as much, have gone through as much detailed critique as some of the papers in these top, really specialist journals, which focus on a particular field. And so a similar thing was happening with the pandemic, that there were some journals that were quite broad and published a lot of stuff, or they're just not very rigorous. And there was a lot of stuff that was published that was just not very good. And a lot of it was actually in journals that were even set up by people who oppose the scientific mainstream view on various things. And then you can kind of guarantee that something that's published in these journals is going to push a different perspective and probably going to be much less rigorously supported.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So you've kind of talked about some good things about it and all that kind of stuff. But as a layman, I would assume, do we have access to see those people that are reviewing the peer-reviewed journal articles?
No. So yeah, so this is one of the things where I think thinking about it as an institution is really helpful, rather than thinking about it as just individuals. So the question for a layperson is, can they trust the institution? So if a paper is published in Nature, do they have any good reason to trust the journal Nature? And this will be really difficult for a lot of lay people, but I think there are good reasons to trust these kind of core institutions of science. So especially like the leading universities, the leading institutes, things like the National Institute of Health in the US. This is a really large collection of experts in a really professional organization that's trying really hard, and it has a lot of rules and guidelines in place to try and make sure that good science is being done. And the same is true of a lot of institutes and universities and leading journals as well. So I think the interconnectedness of all these things and the fact that there are clear guidelines for a lot of these things, they do give people reason to trust the overall institution of science, whilst being aware that sometimes things will get through that aren't actually as well supported as we would hope.
Gotcha. And that kind of gets into, you have, your previous question I asked you, it gets into the idea that, you have a lot of journals out there that almost create their own little field or their own little view, and they only get the journal articles that is for their particular view. But at the same time, though, I mean, even if you don't publish in the big journals, you could still find truth in that, right? Or like what's your approach with that?
Yeah, so I see these as kind of like thresholds. Like if something is peer reviewed in a respectable journal, that doesn't necessarily mean one of the top most prestigious journals, but at least one which is known to be respectable and to have reasonable peer review processes. And that's a good minimal threshold that says, okay, yeah, this is a reason for me to take it seriously. And I think, and there's other, like if it's in a top journal, maybe that's more reason, particularly if it's a top specialist journal in my field, and I know some of the editors, right? I know the authors, that gives me more reason. And the reason you need these filters is because there's so much information out there. and you've got to decide, okay, which stuff do I look at? Which stuff do I, spend my time on? Given that there's millions of articles, and thousands of new books every year, this kind of thing, you can't read everything. So it's irrational, I would say, to read a lot of stuff that comes with no support, like no kind of associated reasons to look at this thing. Given that there's millions of papers and there's a lot of papers that have a lot of expert backing behind them, they have a lot of kind of marks that we associate with being good science. It's reasonable to spend most of your time at least looking at these things. And maybe we can spend a little bit of our time looking at stuff that's kind of coming out of left field, but we should realize that most of that stuff is probably not going to be nearly as good because it hasn't met kind of the minimal criteria that scientists would usually expect for a good scientific paper.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Okay, so skipping ahead a little bit here. So on the topic of trust, and I mean, you talked about we got to trust the big paper, the big I guess organizations or whatever, the big peer review places, because they're known to have the best science. But for a lot of Christians out there, you're gonna have an issue where we don't trust atheistic scientists. Surely they're biased. We'll get into that, but also just the idea that it seems like a lot of that's going to be if you have one big science organization and they're all evolutionists, they're all old earthers, doesn't that mean that it's going to be biased towards everyone else that disagrees with their opinion?
Yeah, so for Christians, I think there's a few things we're thinking about here. So one of them is for most Christians, when they go to their doctor or they go to their lawyer or they go to their accountant, they're not too worried about whether that person is a Christian in terms of the advice that they're getting from this person. So for strictly kind of professional technical advice, usually we actually don't mind whether the person is a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim or whatever. Yeah, so Christians are a minority in kind of general secular academia. And depending where you are, there'll be a very small minority or just a minority. So in some areas and in some fields, like say engineering and some places in the US, there'll be a large number of Christians. There'll be a substantial minority, but a very substantial minority. In some other fields, like evolutionary biology in Western Europe, there'll be a very small minority, but there will still be people there. So I know a number of Christian professors of genetics and geology and evolutionary biology and other related fields. So there are Christians there. And there are even people who disagree with the mainstream views on, say, the age of the Earth or evolution. They're a very small minority, but there's a few of them there in some of these films. So I think people can listen to Christian experts in these fields and talk with them about it and see what they think. I think that's really helpful. Something I was saying before, I think where we got cut off, was with a lot of technical fields, people will go to their doctor, their lawyer, their accountant, and they won't necessarily expect that they're a Christian. They won't necessarily be worried about that. And I think the same maybe should be true for a lot of scientific fields, that for the technical scientific evidence, it's entirely reasonable to trust anyone who has the right expertise in the field. And I think Christians should be open to learning from non-Christians. And Christian thinkers have said this for a long time. People like Augustine back in the early church said that Christians have a lot to learn from, say, the Greek philosophers or these other people. So I think we should be open to hearing these things, whilst also being open to the possibility that some of these things do have a philosophical dimension. So the challenge is to how do we filter out the philosophical worldview aspects from the technical empirical facts. And I think Christians who are experts in the field can help us do that. So it's not just a simple matter of, oh, we can't trust these people because they're atheists or whatever. I think that's not something that Christians apply in most fields. It's not something they should apply in this field either. Yeah, do you have any follow-up? There's so many different angles so you could go down there.
I hear a big claim, and I want to hear your thoughts here, is that, I mean, Answers in Genesis, they have their own scientific research journal. And,
right.
I don't hear much about, like, you have specific people, it seems like, that only post in that journal, don't even worry about anything else. And I've heard the claim that stuff like, oh, if it was that good evidence that it would be posted in other journals. But, that doesn't seem right. Like, I'm sure they have some good journals out there. So, like, I don't know. What do you think about the idea that, Answers to Genesis has their own, like, specific journal? Like, why do you think that they're not willing to post in other things?
Yeah, so you kind of hear different things about this from different people. So some young earth creationists will tell you that young earth creationists are actually publishing a lot in secular journals. I think there are some young earth creationists who publish in secular journals without pulling out what they would consider as the young earth implications of what they're saying, or their work just actually isn't really related at all to their evolution thing. They might say in other contexts that it is, but in reality, when you look at the work, there's not really a connection there, or they haven't made anything about that clear. So this happens sometimes, and there are definitely people with PhDs in the right fields who are, anti-evolution or maybe even young earth. There's a lot of these people. Proportionally, they're a very small number, but still, in terms of just total numbers, there is a few hundred of them, or maybe a few thousand. It's unlikely that young earth stuff is going to get into mainstream journals if it explicitly makes a claim which most scientists would say goes against the vast majority of scientific evidence. So I think it's in this context, it's fine for young earth people to have their own journals, and I read these journals sometimes, not very much, but I used to read them a lot, and it's an interesting idea that this could be true, and the question is, well, does the evidence support it? And unfortunately, I just think the quality of the work there, the reason I don't read them so much now is just the quality, especially in my field in genetics, is just really low. People tell me that in other fields like geology, it's higher. I don't have the expertise to judge that, so I'm not sure. But unfortunately, in my field of molecular genetics, particularly evolutionary or comparative genetics, just the quality of the stuff I see in these journals is mostly just really low, and it wouldn't actually make it into any reasonable journal. Just ignoring the claims that it's making, just the quality of the science that's being done. If this quality of science was being done on a different claim, it wouldn't make it into a good journal. There's probably some exceptions to that young earthers would be very keen to tell me about, but I've looked into a lot of this, and most of it just isn't good quality. And when young earth creationists do good quality work, it can make it into secular journals. So my former boss in Germany actually used to be, before he was my boss, he actually used to be a couple of decades ago a young earth creationist, and he got some papers into some of the very top journals. I think he got a paper in Science and some of the very top journals. And a lot of scientists will never get a paper into these top journals in their careers. A lot of quite good scientists will never get them. So he was a very senior, distinguished scientist, and he was doing good work. And he was coming from a young earth creationist perspective, and he got into some of the top journals. Since then, he's changed his view on that because he realized the evidence really was, in so many different ways, was going against a young earth perspective. But it was still possible for him to do good science within that perspective when he chose to kind of not look into some of the questions, and it was still possible, to get into the good journal. So there wasn't this huge bias against them. People are just interested in, for the most part, scientists are interested in what does this paper that I'm looking at say, and they're not interested in what other stuff has the author said somewhere else. That usually just doesn't come into it. And so that, there's rumors that there's this huge conspiracy against creationists or whatever. And when I've actually talked to researchers who are creationists or who used to be creationists, most of them think this is overstated. It's mostly just that creationists aren't actually submitting to these journals, and or they're just not doing good science, the kind of stuff that we could reasonably expect to get into these journals.
So you think that, see, these other journals that, you know, aren't mainstream journals, that they don't have as good content just because the controls, like what it takes to get into that journal, it's not as high of a standard? Is that it?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes, I've actually been involved in setting up and helping to set up a new journal that is a bit more open-minded about some of the philosophical implications of some of these things. But we have really high standards scientifically, and we've rejected a lot of stuff that scientifically, you know, I expect it will go to some of these other journals, but scientifically it just wasn't at the mainstream standard that we want to uphold. Yeah, so there's a lot of journals where they're looking for content, and their standards are lower, and so most of what they publish will be stuff that's not very good.
What about the topic of like the actual things that are happening in the papers, the articles? So you think about a specific experiment was done. All right, a lot of these times the experiments are done, the papers are being written by the company that has most of the gain from it. You had a lot of this during the epidemic stuff. I don't want to name any specific names, but like why wouldn't we say that, like, if the peer review people, the people actually reading these papers that are looking at the studies or whatever, like they weren't, a lot of them at least weren't actually there. So what's to say that, like, you know, a whole paper can't be faked, or like how would you be able to protect against that?
Yeah, so a lot of science is based on trust. So we are assuming that if someone tells us they did something, we are assuming that they did actually do it. But that said, it's not naive. It's not completely naive and gullible. So, for instance, there's various checks and measures that are in place. So, for instance, if someone is employed by a company, that should go into the paper. So, if there's a financial conflict of interest that somehow relates to, even if it's in a very indirect way, actually, often if you read these scientific papers, people will say, you know, this in some final section, which is conflicts of interest, they'll say this person is on the board of this company and they're on the board of this company. And so some of these senior professors will be on the boards of a few different pharmaceutical companies. And if you look into it, often, you know, these things are not really related to what the paper is saying, but just to be careful, you know, they put the conflict of interest. So that's expected in all kind of mainstream journals, is that if there is especially if there's a direct financial conflict of interest, that should definitely be there. So then anyone who's reading the paper can go, okay, well, this is, you know, funded by the company that would gain a lot if this was true. So we can just be aware of that and think carefully about whether there is a need for additional experiments to confirm this. So the stuff that's really well accepted by the scientific community will usually have been confirmed in multiple ways. Maybe not repeating the exact experiment, but doing a subset or seeing how it does compare to similar experiments, this kind of thing. And if there are anomalies for major results, then this will be discovered over time. At least this is what the scientific process is built on. And it's not perfect, and a lot of stuff doesn't get discovered, especially the stuff in kind of minor journals that, you know, no one's going to bother to check. But for the, you know, if there's a major controversial claim that's published in Science or Nature, one of these top journals, people will be very quick to go and check it. And this happens a lot in my field. Recently, there's been a couple of really big claims in evolutionary biology that were very controversial, and people went back very quickly within a few months and reanalyzed the data that was presented and said it doesn't actually support the claim quite as fully as they were saying, or maybe even did some similar experiments and said, okay, we're not finding the same thing when we do our experiments. There seems to be, you know, the initial claim seems to be overstated in some way, for instance. So yeah, especially with the big controversial claims that are going to be influential, this process of checking is a major part of science. And it's not perfect, but there are some incentives to do that. So if someone publishes in Science, someone else can overturn that, they'll get the rebuttal into a top journal, maybe into Science or another major journal. So yeah, there are incentives for this, and that there is a process behind this, and it does actually help to filter out the stuff that's not as good.
So a big thing you mentioned, it seems like you're saying that when you mean other people reviewing it, you're talking about other people perform the same experiment. So you have one paper that's posted, and then you have another group that comes along and does the same experiments. And I guess you're saying that once we have a few of them, then that's when we can be pretty confident that's true. Is that correct?
Yeah. So for instance, in biology, it's very common to do an experiment on a particular organism, like in mice. And then maybe someone else will do a similar experiment in rats, or other things. And if they see something that's quite different, that will raise question marks, like was there something that was cherry picked or not accurately represented in the first paper? Whereas if you keep getting kind of the same, approximately the same kinds of results, that gives you a lot of confidence that we're always cautious about the exact details and aware that how you present the data is going to make it look slightly different. And the data that is presented might sometimes only be the best results, and there might be some other stuff that would actually kind of slightly undermine it. And that's the reason why replication and doing similar experiments is really helpful, and it's a major part of science. Most science is probably there's not that much science that's really leading edge, that's really doing something dramatically new, make a dramatically new claim. Most science is, using methods that other people developed in a model system and applying it in a slightly different system, at least in biology.
Gotcha. So I noticed you mentioned something along the lines of, well, actually, I'll just say this. So in my studies of the Bible, they also have some type of peer review process. And a lot of times, of course, in archaeology, you're going to get, some super, super, super conservative, like Ron Wyatt types, where they just make these crazy claims, like there's a chariot wheel in the Nile or something like that. And what I've noticed is a lot of people have said that, all right, so that doesn't, a lot of people are actually afraid to do that, like the legit scientists or the legit archaeologists, because once you have that one bad claim, you have that almost associated with your name, or oh, he didn't do good science that one time, so he's probably not going to do it again. Is that something that's common in science in your field or any of that?
Yeah, if someone else rebuts a claim that you made, and that can be embarrassing for the person who made the initial claim, and there's different ways that can happen. So the best case is that so I present a claim, and I publish it in Nature or something, and then someone else finds out there's a problem with it. They email me and say, hey, I was looking at your data, and it, look at column 3, it doesn't match column 7. So, something that this kind of thing is quite common. And then I realize, oh no, I made a mistake. So the best case is then I retract the paper from Science, say, or whatever it was. And so this happens sometimes, that, I realize I made a mistake. Maybe someone else, sends me an email and lets me know. That's kind of the best case in a way. And people actually really respect that I was willing to retract it. And what scientists don't respect is if I keep fighting for the paper, even though I know that there's major problems with it. And so there's kind of an interesting borderline. Every paper will have some minor problems. There'll be minor formatting errors that mean something was not calculated as precisely as it should have been, or something like that. Basically, every large paper that has a lot of data is going to have some minor errors in it. And that's not necessarily a major problem. But if there's kind of major fundamental problems with the paper, then there's kind of an ethical duty for people to try and sort that out. And science as a community is really interested in doing that, and trying to work harder at doing this. And it's not perfect, and getting papers retracted can be a long, difficult process. Sometimes the publishers don't like that because it's not in their interests to do that. But as a community, scientists are very interested in trying to filter out the stuff that isn't well supported or has obvious mistakes in it.
What about, I know in archaeology, there's specifically there's a Mount Ebal tablet, which is like everyone was going crazy at one point. But a big issue what happened was that they went to the press first about it instead of going through the proper peer review. And I could probably see that a lot happening in science where like, oh, we found this really cool scientific claim. We're just going to go to the, the tabloids or whatever and post it there instead of actually doing the peer review first just to make sure it's good. Like, is that something that happens often?
Yeah, so I think that's for some, I don't understand why, but for some reason that seems to be a big issue in like biblical archaeology. There's a few cases of this, I think, but in science, there's, I really think it doesn't happen that much. And I think it's just partly in order to be taken seriously as science, you at least need to have a manuscript. So sometimes this does happen with the preprints, the stuff that hasn't yet been reviewed, but they've posted a preprint. And then what happens more, I think, is a journalist sees that and picks it up and writes an article about it without realizing fully that this is not, hasn't been reviewed by experts necessarily, and it might actually be complete nonsense. There's some level of filter as to what goes onto these preprint servers, but it's a minimal level, so it doesn't catch all of the stuff that it should necessarily. Yeah, but usually for the scientific community to take something seriously, it would have had to have been peer reviewed. If it's on even if it's on a preprint server, it's at least gone through a minimal check that someone has checked in, says, okay, yeah, this does look scientific. It doesn't look like complete nonsense. So I think there's less of a problem, like culturally, that people usually don't just go straight to the media because they want it to be. They wouldn't be treated seriously as scientists if they did it.
That makes sense. All right, so we've talked about like trust, we've talked about the overall idea, but for the layman who maybe this is the first time even learning what peer review is, how can they like one say they have someone gives them, oh, this is a paper that proves my claim. What would you say are some good tips or just a general approach of way to look at it to make sure like, oh, it's not just one article. This isn't like the first time, like maybe there's many journal articles like this that have backed up that claim. Maybe how do we know like if it's just from, random like bad journals or whether it's a good journal? Like how do we, like what's a good approach just to whenever we get a paper like that, what should we do? What steps should we take?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not like a really easy shortcut way to know with some of this stuff. But you can check the journal. You can check whether the journal looks legit. So for me, a lot of people don't like this. They think it's like elitism or something. But for me, it's just a practical thing that, like I said before, there's millions of papers that are published. I think literally millions, at least hundreds of thousands. And you need to filter them somehow, given that that a lot of them at the lower levels are really not good. So a quick way to filter is this like a legitimate journal? Is it known to be? So there's some journals that are known to be basically predatory. That means that they're commercially run and they're mostly in it for the money, and they don't necessarily have strict controls or even necessarily any controls on what gets published. And there's different levels of these journals, and some journals are kind of on the borderline that they don't have a great reputation in the scientific community, but they do have some scientific involvement and some kind of peer review, which might vary in quality. So if it's in one of these journals, that's a reason to kind of take it with more of a grain of salt than if it's in a more kind of mainstream journal that maybe isn't run for profit or is run by one of the major publishers that has a real interest in filtering out the stuff that's low quality. So you can just go to Wikipedia or something and see, what does Wikipedia say about this journal? And they might say it's a predatory journal. They might say, this is one of the best journals in the world in this field, in which case that's one reason to take it seriously. Another thing which you can do which I would recommend, is see whether there's been expert commentary on the paper. So sometimes if there's like a new claim and it's quite controversial, it's getting a lot of attention, experts will actually jump on that quite quickly. And good journals or preprint servers or some other places on the internet provide a place for experts to comment on that paper. So if you Google for this paper and look for the expert comments, sometimes you'll find them on the journal website itself, or at the preprint server, or at one of the places that allows commentary on papers. Yeah, so sometimes, there'll be a really controversial claim that's made, and there'll be a bunch of negative expert comments on that. And then you can see, so I saw this, for instance, with during the pandemic, there were some papers that made some claims that I thought were just fairly obviously very unlikely to be true. And a lot of experts in the field obviously had thought the same thing and had actually listed some technical details as to the problems with the particular paper that I was looking at. Related to that is that some of these papers that are really controversial, they make a point that's somehow politically related, that a lot of people want to be true, but maybe isn't actually well supported. A lot of these papers will be read and shared like hundreds of thousands of times, and that's really abnormal for a paper. Like a good paper in a good scientific journal will usually only be read a few thousand times, because there's only a few thousand experts in any given field who are actually going to be interested in that paper. So even a paper on like Nature, whatever, it's only going to be read a few tens of thousands of times. I think my most read paper has been read about 20,000 times, and that was a paper on COVID, and it got some media attention, and it was actually quite popular. But some of these papers on issues like masking or vaccines, if they're making a point which goes against the mainstream, they'll be read like 600,000 times, 1,000,000 times. And for a scientist who looks at it, they know immediately there's something very strange about this paper. It means that it's very popular. Some of these papers have crazy numbers of views, like 1,000,000 or 600,000 or something. And that's a signal that there's something kind of political or like non-scientific going here as to why this is so popular. And that's not necessarily a sign that it's wrong. Sometimes something controversial or popular is right, but it is a sign there's something really unusual happening there. And it's a reason to take it with a grain of salt, because usually, at least during the pandemic, papers that were like this, they ended up being retracted because they got attention and experts piled on and found a bunch of problems with the study. So sometimes a study kind of slips through the processes of journal peer review, and experts wonder how did that get there? And it happens because whoever was peer reviewing was not really an expert or didn't have the right kind of expertise. I think that happens sometimes, or does happen quite often. And so they, maybe they gave critical comments on a minor aspect of the study, whereas there were some major flaws that they missed, or the editor didn't focus on those comments or that kind of thing. So yeah, peer review is not perfect, and stuff does slip through. But if it becomes really controversial, gets a lot of attention, then often experts will come back and check it really closely as to whether it is really well supported. Yeah, so those were some of the things that people can do. They can look at the kind of journal it's in, if that's credible, look for expert commentary, and see if there's something abnormal about the way this paper is being responded to by the wider public.
Yeah, so I've read a lot of papers, not that many, but I feel like I've read at least 50 papers in my life, as far as like scientific journals, and I'm not even a science guy. But at the same time, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about as far as like people commenting, and you can like see people's comment on it. Is there any possible chance that you could share your screen and show us? You mentioned all this talk about like criticism and like you can look at a paper and then like people can maybe comment it on, or you can see responses to it. Could you possibly show us how to access these comments?
Click OK, then click on comments.
Okay, comment.
Yeah.
Easy enough.
Yeah, so these.
What do we have here?
So this was just a couple of experts who found some follow-up results that seem interesting and that are somehow related to our paper. So that's just one example. It wasn't a critical comment, but with papers that have major problems, sometimes they will get critical comments where other scientists point out problems with the methods or that kind of thing. So yeah, you can see this on some published papers. Some journals have this, or on the preprint of the paper if that was published. The preprint server has a place where anyone can comment, or there's other things online. If people Google for like expert commentary on scientific papers, they'll find.
What about the significance? All right, so say like we had a lot of this during the pandemic where just like one journal article was posted, and for me, I have absolutely no idea how many journal articles are posted on it. So it seems like just one journal article is posted. What is the significance of that? I mean, do we have to have like 4 or 5 good journal articles for us to consider like legit science, or like what do you think about that?
So anything that's published in a credible journal is legit science, kind of by definition, I would say. But that doesn't mean that it's that doesn't mean that it's true. And working out whether it is true or not is going to be really difficult, unfortunately. But the same is true of any expert area. So a lot of people get annoyed about this, or they get nervous about it, or they think there's something kind of dodgy happening. But the same is true in any expert area. Like if there's a major construction project happening and they're building a new bridge, I wouldn't walk into the office of that construction project and say, "Hey guys, you're doing it wrong. You should be using a different kind of concrete for your bridge." Like I have no idea about bridges. I can't comment on that. And it would be crazy for me to think that I could, when the experts have spent multiple years studying and practicing this. The same with law. I have no idea about most legal issues. It would be crazy to listen to me for legal advice on these things. Unfortunately, science is another technical field where to really get into weighing the pros and cons of different methods in a specific area, you probably need a bit of study in that area. And there's nothing super special about that. It's also true in law and civil engineering and sending a rocket to space. There are people who have the expertise, and the vast majority of people don't. And if you want to understand what's happening in the area, it's going to take a bunch of study. If people want to do that study, then they can start reading the papers. I'd actually recommend, it might sound silly, but I'd recommend starting with Wikipedia. It has a lot of great articles at kind of an overview level of kind of any topic that you're interested in. And for most topics, Wikipedia is a reasonable introduction to the topic. And then you can follow the links on Wikipedia to actually start digging into the literature. But without a background, someone with no biology background is not going to have useful comments to make in any kind of really specific technical field of evolutionary population genetics or epidemiology or virology or things like that.
So you talked about like and in the past we've talked about like your background. So like if you yourself, you're going to have a really good background of a lot of paper, a lot of subjects, because you've been in the field, the people, I would assume that like, oh, that scientist, he's a good scientist, he's going to have good stuff. The journals, what papers have been published previously, where the topic is, where the consensus is, all that. And of course, the layman doesn't know a lot of that. It's almost, from my standpoint, a lot of times when I'm looking at papers, I have no idea what I'm looking at. So like, what is a layman supposed to do there? Like, do we just trust? Like, how do we even figure that out? Because you have people that are biased, and do we just outright trust? Like, is there even a good way to be relevant, like understand the information well, or the current literature, all that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is an important role for Christians who are in different fields. So if there was something controversial to do with the law, say, maybe there's like it's controversial how this law should be interpreted, or whether this law is even actually, whether a claim is actually legal or not legal, or something like that, then I would want to, and if it's particularly related to a Christian issue for some reason, then I would want to go to a Christian lawyer friend and see what they think about it. And I think the same is maybe true for scientific issues, particularly where they seem kind of controversial, and like they seem like, I'm not sure if I can trust an atheist scientist on this because they might be biased. You can go to Christian scientists and ask them about it. Even more so, you can go to organizations of, say, Christian scientists. So if there's an issue to do with medical ethics and it's really controversial, and I want a good, carefully thought through Christian perspective on it, I would go to the Christian Medical Fellowship. I think in the US it's the CMDA, Christian Medical and Dental Association. This kind of organization is designed as an organization of Christians in this area, and they'll often release public statements on controversial issues. So they'll have something to say about, vaccination potentially, or about mask wearing maybe, or COVID, or other things, or there'll be some organizations of Christian experts in evolution, and they'll make statements, and then you can weigh, you can weigh these statements. But that's a good place to start, I think, is either Christians you know personally who are in the field, or these organizations of Christian experts in different fields.
So I guess you can do that. I mean, specifically on the topic of evolution and an old Earth, the age of the Earth, all that kind of stuff. I guess you can go to people, YouTubers. I know I'm in contact with, there's people like in Facebook groups. You can talk to the experts there. You can email them, I guess. And I guess for my general approach with like any topic, I would never be confident about a topic unless I've really studied it, specifically because there's so many nuances in a lot of these topics. But I guess this is an approach I take. I don't know. Tell me what you think about this. Is that like if I'm going to study, say, the topic of the age of the Earth, like, okay, I'll find a good Christian young Earth creationist and be like, okay, what are your arguments here? I'll maybe even talk to them, maybe even ask questions, or maybe even talk to multiples, and then also talk to multiples, read a lot of books and all that kind of stuff on the other side, so I can have a general idea of all this. I feel like if you just talk to one, you can have a lot of bias. Like, who knows that one specific person is going to be biased. So if you talk to a lot of them, like, is that a good approach? Like, it sounds like that when I'm explaining it, it sounds like I'm just saying, okay, read it, like, learn as much as you can. Like, is that what it is? Is that all it is?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to argue with experts in an area, then you're probably going to need to become an expert, and that's just how it is, really. If you think the experts are all wrong about a topic, firstly, that's not that likely. But secondly, it could be true. But then you're going to need to show that you understand their arguments and you understand the evidence that they are using. And it's very common. It's kind of notorious for like retired engineers to comment on astrophysics, or comment on evolution, or comment on epidemiology during the pandemic. And there's certain groups of people who think they can comment on anything, but the experts just don't take them seriously, because they can see that they're not engaging with the actual details that the experts are on a daily basis. And so it's the facts that are specific to the field that are important, and that's going to coming to grips with that in a detailed way is going to take some time. But for a high level overview, you can go to these kind of general statements from groups like the Christian Medical Fellowship, or Christians in Science, or in the US, it's ASA, the American Scientific Affiliation. There's lots of these kinds of organizations that will have some statements on some of the key issues, which is at least a starting point to see what a large group of Christians who hold to a particular belief statement will say about an issue.
Cool. So last question here. So say you have someone that just is not familiar with the topic of all of evolution, not familiar with the topic of the age of the Earth, and they want to get onto the topic, but they don't want like, you know, some biased approach. They want to be able to, they want to know the truth of it. They don't want to just fancy their whatever they want to believe. What would you say is the best approach to that? Like, where should they look? What resources can they take on that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, everyone is going to be biased on this kind of topic. Like everyone has a perspective on it. Like everyone who's thought about it, but is going to have a perspective. Even if their perspective is we can't know the truth, that's still, you know, a perspective that some people have. I think so. Yeah, I think a good way is to really compare ideas. One easy way to do that is to read one of the kind of like 3 views books or 4 views books. There's a bunch of these on issues to do with the age of the Earth and evolution, or to listen to a debate. So I actually really, there's a debate between C. John Collins and Albert Mohler on the age of the Earth. So C. John Collins, or Jack Collins, is a conservative Presbyterian theologian, and Albert Mohler is a conservative Southern Baptist theologian. Albert Mohler is a young earther, C. John Collins is an old earther, and they debate whether scripture basically compels us to believe in a young earth. That's a really good debate, and I think C. John Collins does really well on that. But there's a few of these debates. So it depends what kind of format people are interested in, whether they want to read, whether they just want a brief statement, or whether they want to hear an audio debate or a written debate. There's debate books, or whether they actually want to dig into the technical details. And on the technical details, there's, you know, obviously different angles on it. So there's the question of biblical interpretation, and so there's a lot of work in biblical studies to do with that. But then there's philosophical questions about what's the right philosophy of science, what counts as science, what counts as evidence in this kind of debate. And then there's the scientific issues as well. What does the science actually say? What's the empirical data which is relevant to the debate? And so people can't be an expert on all of these, but different people have different interests that they could specialize in if they want to.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. Thank you so much for coming on here. This has been a lot of fun. I'm sure a lot of people are going to get something out of this. Is there any place that you would like to send people? Like, you have a website or books you've written that people can learn more about your stuff?
Yeah, so I just have a website, just my name, ZacharyArdern.com. I've written a few things at Capturing Christianity, and I'll hopefully be writing a bit more for them soon. And I have a couple of interviews with them as well. So Capturing Christianity is one of the main places on YouTube where I've done some stuff and written some stuff on their website as well. My friend Arope Kuyonen and myself had a couple of interviews on Capturing Christianity, and if they want the really detailed approach that we take to the question of evolution and design, that's the place to go at the moment. His books are really excellent if you really want to dig into the details of a carefully thought through Christian attitude, which is kind of a middle way between evolution and design. I think he's got a really good approach to that. But there's, you know, lots of organizations out there that discuss these things, lots of books and resources. People can email me as well if they have particular questions, especially scientific ones that they want my perspective on. They're welcome to reach out to me.
Yeah, I definitely recommend those. Definitely check out his channel. Well, thank you for coming on here, Zach. This has been an awesome experience. Everyone, make sure to like and subscribe if you want more content in science, the Bible, all that kind of stuff. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you have a great rest of your day, Zach.
Thanks.